So let's start off by talking about arguably the most important aspect of any good plan, and that's going to be the preparation that goes into it. Right? Again, whether we're looking at the SANS or the NIST incident response frameworks, preparation is the foundation that makes everything else possible. Right? Without it, every other step, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, all of this becomes entirely, reactive and chaotic and overall just less effective. And with the preparation stage, our goal essentially is in the name, right? It's to prepare and get our people and processes and technology within our organization ready to handle incidents. And this is obviously a very important step because it directly impacts how effectively and efficiently a team can respond to incidents, which is going to feed into our potential to minimize damage and recover things quickly. And really, it's about making sure that we have clearly defined roles and responsibilities, and that we've developed and tested our incident response plan, and that our people, our staff are trained, and that we have visibility, right, into our network, and that we've deployed the necessary tools and technologies to detect and respond to threats. In other words, preparation ensures that, when, not if, but when a security incident happens, we're not scrambling to figure out what to do, right? We've already laid the groundwork. The absolute worst time to start preparing for an incident is after one has already been identified. Often when we're dealing with incidents or, if we're alerted on an incident like a data breach or, something as frightening as an ongoing ransomware attack, well, there's often this feeling of uncertainty and dread as we sort of stare up at the summit of what seems to be an unclimbable mountain. But if we have a plan in place and a plan that we can enact and rely on, policies and procedures that are ready to go, resources that we can leverage, and trained personnel that we can collaborate with, well, some of that fear and uncertainty melts away because we have a proper way to move forward and kick our plan into action and do what we need to do. And really, this phase goes beyond just setting up an incident response capability. It also involves taking some proactive measures to help prepare or secure our systems and networks, but also our people. Right? And so let's begin by focusing on people. And not just the incident responders and security teams, but all of the stakeholders involved in an incident. Right? End users, for example. They're often seen as the organization's first line of defense, right? Since they interact with systems daily, they play this crucial role in detecting and preventing incidents, while also being a common source of human error as well. And so that's why security awareness training is often very important in implementing policy and efforts to make sure that employees are staying informed and vigilant. And so we often see organizations that have great success sort of by delivering this kind of security awareness training, whether it be in-house or through different vendors like KnowBe4 or Huntress Sat or Cofense and many others. Sort of covering a lot of these attacker 101 topics, right? Like recognizing phishing or social engineering attacks, or having good password hygiene and management, and often the ability to run simulated phishing campaigns to test and reinforce user awareness. Again, with many of these platforms, again, we have things like KnowBe4 or Posteron Security, which is a fantastic security awareness training platform out of Canada that I was fortunate enough to work for in the past. So maybe there's a little bit of national pride and personal bias there. But again, a lot of these platforms often will integrate some kind of phishing or incident report workflow for end users to interact with to really streamline incident reporting to the SOC, particularly in the realm of things, again, like phishing or social engineering attempts. Now, beyond end users, we're going to have a lot of stakeholder involvement that spans across different teams, right? Like our IT teams, legal advisors, public relations, right? And of course, executives or management, right? And all of these groups are going to play their own important role during an incident. For example, again, our IT teams, really a department or a group that we really want to become friends with. Right? They can really make things happen when it comes to containing, eradicating, and recovering. Right? They often hold the keys to the kingdom, as it were, and so we don't want to be scrambling to identify systems or generate network maps or pull asset data or get our hands on credentials or keys that we need in the middle of an incident and deal with all of that red tape that might slow us down. Right? Anytime we're interacting with infrastructure or navigating across the environment, IT support and buy-in is going to be pretty critical here. Now, also legal, right? We can think about how a legal team can help advise us on data breach response and help the organization navigate some of those legal and regulatory different compliance requirements that are involved in managing and reporting breaches, as well as data protection and governance and privacy. Now, along those lines, again, public relations, right? Some kind of facet in our organization to really help handle public messaging, right? And this holds a lot more weight than it sounds. Incidents can very quickly spin out of control. And if you have messaging coming from multiple, uncoordinated sources within the organization, it can really create confusion and conflicting communication, not only internally to the teams that are dealing with incidents and, different staff and employees, but really importantly, to the external as well, right? To the public. And so this can really quickly lead to wild speculation. Again, especially if the incident is of public interest or if it's heavily scrutinized. And this can really damage the organization's reputation and really make this situation even worse. And so often it's best to establish a single point of contact for any and all external communications to ensure that consistency and clarity and control over the narrative or the messaging. And so we'll often consult the people who know how to talk to the public, right? Who know what to say and know what statements to put out and when, and sort of how that communication chain flows. Now, again, we can't forget about management and data owners as well, right? Because they're really going to make critical decisions about business operations. Data owners in particular might need to weigh the risks of certain containment actions, right? Maybe isolating compromised systems and weigh that against the prospect of maintaining business continuity, right? And so knowing who the key data owners are during an incident is going to be really important because they're often the ones that decide whether it's acceptable to isolate or stop a specific business operation or function in order to recover from an incident, right? Maybe like a server or an application. And in the cases where the affected system or network is required for business continuity, well, that's not always going to be an easy green light. And so sometimes the incident response team is going to need to work with data owners and different key stakeholders to create a long-term containment plan that doesn't immediately stop access or isolate the system, but also still ensure that the compromise can't really spread or worsen. And so we'll talk much more about containment strategies when we get there. Now, speaking of communication planning, communication planning itself is a core part of incident response readiness. We need to have, as I mentioned earlier, clear channels for employees to report incidents. We need to maintain things like contact information for internal and external responders. And things like escalation paths and on-call procedures, right? So there's this whole kind of communication aspect that goes beyond just the technical response efforts as well. Now, if an organization doesn't have the capacity for a fully fledged incident response team, or maybe they just lack a team with sufficient forensic expertise, well, some organizations implement incident response retainers with third-party firms in sort of an effort to ensure that we have expert responders that are on call and accessible when needed. And so we really need to have these processes in place, whatever they may be, to avoid delays in mobilizing our resources and securing approvals during an emergency. And when it comes to specifically communicating during an incident, we often have this concept of out-of-band communication channels as sort of a best practice. Basically, this idea of providing an alternative secure method of communication if perhaps the primary systems of communication are compromised, right? The idea here is that, if we have an intrusion, well, we might not know how deep that intrusion goes. The attacker might actually be listening in or trying to compromise our incident response channels and learn what we know about the compromise so far and what remediation efforts we might decide on. Right? And so obviously leaking this kind of information to the attacker would completely undermine any response actions that we want to take. And so this could be just as simple as using any kind of encrypted messaging app like Signal or Telegram, really any other messaging channels that aren't normally used for regular business activity. Or, of course, in some cases, we have more sophisticated solutions like dedicated secure collaboration platforms, or maybe air-gapped communication lines, right? Or just sort of alternative telephone lines, for example. The lengths that we might want to go here to secure our communications really just depends on our risk profile and sort of who we're up against. Now, evidence handling, right? That also requires its own preparation. We need secure ways to store and the capability to maintain the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the evidence that we're collecting. Right? So whether that be using encryption or implementing physical and anti-tampering controls, and ensuring that the evidence is available through different redundancy measures. There's plenty different mechanisms and strategies we could go into here, but basically the idea is that we have secure storage facilities or secure solutions to keep and track our evidence. Now, particularly on the concept of integrity and evidence admissibility, we have this concept of the chain of custody. Particularly when we think about more traditional digital forensics and maybe dealing with cybercrime investigations. And this refers to the documentation and tracking of evidence from the moment it's collected up until it's presented in court, basically ensuring that it hasn't been tampered with or altered in any way. But really, no matter what kind of incident we might be working on, we need to have procedures in place to track who has access and who's been transferring evidence. Now, from a technical standpoint, incident response teams also need to prepare hardware and software for forensic analysis, right? Maybe, having a forensic workstation, different imaging tools, a lot of storage material, right? Even things like write blockers, secure ways to store our evidence like we talked about, and different peripherals. The list really goes on. And again, in more traditional forensic cases, when you think about arriving on site and securing the scene and collecting evidence, we often see this kind of thing pre-packed into a jump kit that's sort of ready for deployment. Right now, as we'll see throughout the course, things are kind of changing, and we're doing a lot more remote and real-time evidence collection, and in some cases, moving away from this more traditional scenario. And so we're going to cover all throughout the course many techniques and tools and software that assist us in collecting, triaging, and analyzing evidence. Now remember, having a strong incident response planning function also involves taking some proactive measures to prepare not only our systems, but our people, right? Our incident response team as well. And so when we think about training for incidents, we can think about running simulated exercises or tabletop exercises to run through a potential incident or maybe a set of incidents and ensure that we have all of the resources and all of the technical means in place to quickly and effectively respond. And so by running simulated exercises, say for example on if a ransomware incident occurs or if a specific server or a set of servers are compromised, this can be a great way for teams to prepare to handle incidents. Because in doing so, we can very quickly identify if we have any potential gaps in, say, our monitoring, or maybe the fact that we lack the ability or the access to certain evidence sources. And so we can effectively simulate and answer, some of the investigative questions that we would if this were a real incident. If we take a look at the NIST Special Publication 800-84, or the Guide to Test, Training, and Exercise Programs for IT Plans and Capabilities, this publication provides more information on conducting some of these exercises, and it gives us some sample scenarios as well if we look at the appendix. In a more interactive sense, there's also a very fun game developed by Black Hills Information Security, or BHIS, which is called Backdoors and Breaches, which is, yes, essentially an actual card game to help teams conduct incident response tabletop exercises and learn different attack tactics and tools and methods. We can also think about, conducting mini purple team or maybe adversary simulation type exercises as well to, again, simulate real attacks in our environment and assess what is being logged, right? What is being detected and sort of where are the gaps in our response capability. Now, again, this is far from the entirety of concepts that we'll find in something like the NIST 800-61 or the SANS Incident Handler's Handbook. We can dive deeper into policy, of course, things like documentation and access controls, and sort of building up the incident response team itself, but we'll get to a lot of that later on and throughout the course. For now, again, the high level here is that our incident response plan quickly falls apart without proper preparation. And so we need to put a lot of that initial work in to set a solid foundation. And just like we discussed, we're constantly improving and feeding insights from our lessons learned and throughout our response process back into preparation, right? And so we get this continually improving and evolving feedback loop.